dive in specifically to the Old Testament now. Big thanks to Will for everything that he shared. So can somebody just raise your hand, name the different types of genre or literature types in the Old Testament? One's right above me. Narrative. What else do we have? Say it again.
Like poetry.
Poetry or psalms. Yep. What else? Prophets. Yep. We have narrative, prophets, psalms, the law. One other big one. Wisdom. Wisdom literature. And so this next hour we're talking about specifically narrative. And in narrative we're going to see it makes up 40% of our Old Testament text. So a huge portion of our Old Testament is written in narrative type of literature. Take a guess at different types of narratives or the different books in our Old Testament that have narrative in them.
Genesis.
Psalms is not one. Genesis has a lot of narrative. Exodus has narrative, yes? Joshua has narrative. Ruth is narrative. Job is not narrative.
What?
No.
But Kings.
A lot of Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel.
Song of Solomon.
So here's different books in our Old Testament that have good portions of narrative in them. Genesis, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Jonah, and Haggai. The Old Testament, right? We come to the Old Testament and maybe we have frustrations with it, we're confused by it, critical of it, and we come to it and we're like, man, what's the purpose of the Old Testament? The Old Testament has incredible applications for us. As Christians, the Old Testament is your spiritual history. The promises and calling of God to Israel are the historical promises and callings for us. They're not our callings and promises, but they're our spiritual history. And so we certainly have a lot to learn from them. But specifically about narratives. Narratives are stories retelling the historical events of the past that are intended to give meaning and direction for a given people in the present time. So a narrative is something communicated about something that happened in the past, but it has an intended purpose for people today. Right? The really difficult thing with the Old Testament is there is narrative that was written that was originally intended for the Israelites and the Jews that still has implications for us today, but it's almost like this twofold thing that we're looking at. We're trying to figure out, okay, what was it originally intended for them, and then how does it apply to me, which is a lot of what Will just shared. But a narrative, a narrative's made up of three primary things. There's characters, there's a plot, there's plot resolution. Characters have there's the protagonist, antagonist, and agonist. Right? The plot, we'll get to the plot resolution. Has everybody seen Remember the Titans?
Yes.
I was trying to think of something that was close to historical, right? Obviously it's dramatized. Remember the Titans. Who is the protagonist in Remember the Titans? Denzel Washington. What's his name?
Coach Boone.
Coach Boone.
Yeah.
So Coach Boone, the protagonist is the main character, and usually the hero of the story, right? Coach Boone, Denzel Washington, is the protagonist in Remember the Titans. Who's the antagonist?
The racist people.
Yeah. It's not white, it's just racism in general, right? And anybody that's opposed to the integration of this high school in Virginia. Fun fact, for those of us that know Colin Sanborn's dad was a freshman on that team. He actually has a whole scrapbook with some of these guys in that. It's pretty cool. So you can ask him, he'll show it to you sometime. The agonist, right? And agonists are different characters that are heavily involved with the plot, but they're not the main character, the hero. So who are some of the agonists in Remember the Titans?
The big dude.
Pete Jones.
B.D. Jones,
Julius.
Running back.
Julius Campbell,
Okay.
right?
Bertier.
Gary Bertier, Sunshine,
Yes.
right? Who's the coach? The other coach?
Coach.
The previous head coach.
Defensive court.
Yeah, his daughter Hayden Panettiere or whatever her name is. Yeah, so we've got all these different players or these different characters, but who's the protagonist? Denzel Washington, Coach Boone, right? It's primarily about him. He's going to be the hero, brings everybody together. The plot of the story, integrating this high school, using athletics to help the integration process. The athletes kind of lead the charge. They become brothers, right? Face great opposition, both on the field, off the field, in the classroom, in the school, out of the school. There's this great tragedy that happens. What's the great tragedy before the great climax? Car accident, right? Gary Bertier, boom, knocked out, done with football. Everybody rallies, they win the state title, prove that integration's good for at least the state of Virginia and obviously eventually the rest of the country. But kind of just a basic understanding of narrative, right? True events, sure it's a little bit dramatized, but Denzel Washington's the protagonist. I'm harping on this idea of protagonist. We'll come back to it. When it comes to the story of the Bible, right? We've been talking about this in the Bowling Green Church. What's the cycle? What's the plot of the Bible? Remember that's that cycle. The fall, creation, right? And then the fall, then restoration, and eventually redemption in the New Testament, right? The Old Testament is going to repeat the cycle of creation, fall, restoration. Creation, fall, restoration. Redemption eventually comes through Jesus. Who is the protagonist of every biblical story? God. God is the protagonist of every biblical story. Who is not the protagonist? Any other person. Noah is never the protagonist. Noah is not the protagonist. David is not the protagonist, right? And the reason I'm harping on this with narrative is the moment man becomes the protagonist, we've already missed the thrust or the crux of what the Bible's trying to communicate to us, right? Because eventually it's more about being like David, right? Being like Daniel, being like Moses, but the reality is they're not the hero. They're fallen, broken people just like you and I. And so one of the really, really important things when reading our Bible is to remember that God is the protagonist. God is the hero. God is the main character. In order to discuss what narratives are, I want to first kind of touch on what narratives are not and being careful of using them improperly. One big thing is narratives are not allegories with hidden messages. We've got to be really, really careful, especially nowadays. There's a popular podcast that I really enjoyed probably 2 or 3 years ago that there's a lot of nuggets that I gained from it. But the issue I began to have with this podcast is it felt like every episode the guy was saying, hey, I know this is what people think it means, but this is what it actually means. And he kept trying to find these hidden messages in the text. And the Bible isn't filled with allegory. It's not filled with a bunch of these hidden messages. And we've got to be careful of overly using symbolism when it comes to our Bibles, right? I should have thought of a good example, but I don't have one. Another thing, and this is an area that I really, really struggled with, especially as a young Christian. Old Testament narratives are not strictly moral lessons. That's not saying we can't learn morality through these stories, but the story's primary purpose is not to teach you morality. I had a big issue with this idea because, especially when I was reading through Genesis, and I was finding these men that I was incredibly inspired by. Their faith, their deeds, their sacrifice. But then I came to their imperfections, and I didn't understand how to rationalize their imperfections. What are some of Noah's imperfections? He gets drunk. Yeah, he gets drunk right after the flood. What are some of Abraham's imperfections?
He's a coward.
A coward and a liar, right? Jacob, I had no idea what I was supposed to imitate. Jacob's life for a large portion of it just seems like a train wreck, right? He manipulates into gaining his brother's birthright. He's self-promoting. He's selfish. He helps manipulate situations with his mom. And we read it and we're like, man, what are we supposed to do with this dude, right? Joseph, incredibly arrogant early on. And so you come to these people and so they're not moral lessons. They're stories about God and God's people. It's His story that He's written us into. And then lastly, they're not strictly about sin and doctrine. Are there nuggets about sin and doctrine that we can learn from narrative? Yes. But God will not define sin until we get to the law. Okay? And so, are there things we can learn about morality? Certainly. Are there things that we can learn about what to do and what not to do? Yes. Whether it's marriage, parenting, righteousness, but that's not their primary message. Are you with me? Has anybody else really struggled with this? Like the first couple times you read the Old Testament, you're like, whoa, what am I supposed to get from this guy that's blowing it royally? Yeah. I remember actually distinctively Rahab, right? God's people come in, and what does Rahab do? She lies. But she's lifted up and honored in the story and then obviously in Jesus' lineage, but she lies. And I struggled. I was like, wait, why should I imitate this liar? Right? What on top of that? What is? She's a prostitute. Right? And so I struggled. I was like, okay, but am I supposed to be a prostitute? Am I supposed to be a liar? Like, I wrestled with these things. Maybe I'm alone in it. But these three things are huge. They're not allegories. They're not strictly moral lessons. And they do not regularly teach about sin or doctrine. Does that make sense? Even that last part, and I'm glad I have this note in there. Just because they don't explicitly or regularly teach about sin, does it mean we can't learn about sin? Well, certainly not, right? David and Bathsheba is a great example. And even in there is some explicit communication about sin because Nathaniel comes in and gives us additional narrative on top of the story that's like, whoa. What happened with David is awful. Are you with me?
Yeah.
All right, talked about what narratives are not. Let's talk about some characteristics of narratives. Before we get into this, let's rewind. What are the three primary categories that make up a narrative? Character, plot, resolution. Great, thanks, Will. So when we're reading narratives, it's important to recognize who the narrator is. That question is a bit difficult too because sometimes the person narrating the story isn't necessarily even the person who wrote the story. Okay? But it's important to recognize who the narrator is because it gives us a point of view that's rather important. As we're reading narratives, it's important to see, to recognize the different scenes that play out. This is going to play really similar to maybe like a Shakespeare play. But you remember reading plays in high school and it was like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, whatever. That's important to follow. It is important to recognize the characters, protagonist, antagonist, agonist. And I can't believe I forgot this. Who is ultimately the antagonist in every story? Satan and his powers. Right? It starts in the Garden of Eden, and it's carried on throughout the Old Testament and ultimately the New Testament. We've got to be very, 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 very careful of villainizing and demonizing anyone in the Bible. Who does Paul say our war is against? In the book of Ephesians. Not flesh and blood, but the spiritual forces of evil in this world, right? So we've got to recognize that there is a supernatural power that's in opposition to God. It's on the very first pages of Genesis, and they're going to continue through our Old Testament, even into our New Testament. So characters, I circle back on that. Dialogue is going to be super important. It's kind of it's pausing a scene and it's zooming in, and there's something that the narrator wants us to understand. Repetition. If you ever see repetition's huge. And one of the huge reasons that repetition is huge is this idea called a chiasm, or some people call it a menorah structure. What's a menorah look like? Yeah, so the outside connect, right? Then the next level connects, and then the inside connects, and then you've got this kind of standalone middle candle, right? That type of rhetoric is used again and again and again throughout our Bibles. It's a really, really common Hebrew type of communication device. And so whenever you see repetition, and when I say repetition, I don't necessarily even mean the next line. Sometimes it's the next line, but it might be pages later. Whenever you see repetition, recognize that, oh man, there might be a chiasm here. And this is often how it'll go. Maybe it's not this long, maybe it's a lot longer. A, B, C, D, C, B, A. Right? And sometimes it's not even that clean. But it's going to use this. And the interesting part about this is oftentimes in our communication, the most important part of a story happens when? At the end. Who said that? Thanks, Steve. In these chiastic structures, the most important part is the middle. Right? And what the author's doing is he's almost taking a magnifying glass and he's trying to say, like, look at what I'm showing you. Right? It's like boom, boom, boom. Like this is the major thrust of what I'm trying to help you understand. Another thing that's important with scenes is it's going to be cool. We're going to talk about it in Noah. If there's ever something that's being communicated, and then there's a pause, and then there's kind of this offshoot, and then it comes back to the main story, that offshoot is usually really, really important. Okay? I hate that I'm showing you this because I'm giving away my sermon for the next 2 or 3 weeks. The story of Noah is one of, I think, the coolest, most beautiful, most powerful chiasms in the Bible. And we're going to see it over the next couple of weeks. But this chiasm, you can see it stretches. You probably can't see it. It's probably too small. But it stretches from, it actually stretches from chapter 5 all the way to chapter 9. And go over to chapter 5 for me. I'm going to preach about this again on Sunday, so you have a leg up. But this paints a really cool example. Chapter 5, verse 1. Man.
Yeah.
Sorry. This is chapter 5, verse 1. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God, right? Repeating Genesis chapter 3. He created them male and female and blessed them, and he named them mankind, and they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years. What's really cool is that structure from verse 3 to verse 5 is just repeated again and again and again. Look, Seth lived 105 years, became the father of this guy. Seth lived 807 more years. Seth lived these years, and then he died. right? Skip down to Jared, down in verse 18. Jared lived this many years, fathered Enoch, lived 800 years after that, had other sons and daughters. Jared lived a total of 962 years, then he died. It's just repeated again and again and again in this lineage. It goes down to Lamech in verse 28. Lamech lived this many years. He bore this guy named Noah. It tells us a little bit about Noah, right? Then Lamech lived another 595 years, had other sons and daughters, lived a total of 770 years, and then he died. You see how that style is repeated again and again and again. Watch what the author does. It's so cool. He said, after Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But it doesn't continue. Right? He had this pattern he was following. He followed it again and again and again. And then he introduces Noah, but he doesn't continue in the same pattern. Right? Instead, in verse 6, he's going to begin to introduce the flood. He gives this incredible story about the flood. The climax of the flood is chapter 8, verse 1. But then if you go to chapter 9, go all the way to end of chapter 9. Somebody read verse 28.
After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. Noah lived a total of 950 years, and then he died.
So stinking cool. So what the author did was he took this lineage that was showing us Noah, and then he broke Noah's lineage up, and then he stuck Noah's life in the flood smack dab in the middle. So what the author's doing is he's beginning and ending a chiasm. He's introducing Noah, and then just like he did with all these other people, he's going to repeat the same way of this lineage, right? He lived this many total years, and then he died. But he's not going to do that without inserting the flood and the ark. And in that flood and the ark, he's going to do the A, B, C, D, E, I don't even know, all the way to H, I, J, maybe. And then he's going to take that and he's going to reverse it the rest of the way. And what we're going to do the next 3 weeks in our sermon series is we're basically, we won't read all of 6, 7, 8, and 9. We're going to do the beginning of 6 and the end of 9 or 8 or whatever it is. And we're going to kind of march our way into the center 3 weeks from now. But am I making sense? So you can see the chiasm. It's beautiful. So if you want to understand the story of the flood, you've got to figure out the chiasm. If you miss the chiasm, you miss the whole thrust of what God was trying to communicate to the original audience. Are you with me? One other thing to note, just really quick, and then we'll have a bit of an exercise that shouldn't take terribly long. One thing to note is the question of what was God originally trying to communicate will save you and other people that you're trying to help understand the Bible so much headache and meaningless arguments. Somebody who wants to go to the book of Genesis and have an argument over the age of the earth or evolution or the Big Bang Theory, they've already skipped the most important question. Because when Genesis was written with the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, was the purpose of Genesis to explain evolution, to explain the Big Bang Theory, or explain the age of the universe? No, not at all, right? And what's so special about it is actually the more you dive into Genesis, the less you care. Because you recognize that the Bible was never a science book that was intended to answer these questions. Right? And the more you're really understanding, oh my gosh, look at what God's communicating to mankind. And so, and I've got my opinions about that, and I'll share them with you at a different point. But it's just, yeah. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Pause here. Questions about some of this. Yeah.
Very good question. So I know the idea of like a chiasm, but I also know that like, is there a good way to tell while reading the Old Testament? Because of course when we read through the Old Testament, we read from one part all the way through to another part. unless you just happen to kind of start realizing that there's correlations between like the beginning and the end, how would you know where a chiasm is at in the Bible? Does that make sense?
Good question. Yeah. I'm going to get off that so it doesn't distract you too much. A good commentary is super important. One of the websites I use for commentaries, there's a website called bestcommentaries.com. It sounds a little bit bootleg. But
How many viruses you got?
no, you don't. I promise you don't. You can't view commentaries on the website, but they will point you to great commentaries, and you can rent them through library apps. Right? You don't have to go to the library. I rent a lot of commentaries through Hoopla and Libby, which are just local apps that as long as you have a library card, you'll have access to them. So good commentary is important. But chiasms typically are going to be found within a single story unit, and so bye bud. They're probably like trying to find a chiasm that spans from Noah into Joseph. Those are completely different acts and scenes, and so just as you're reading it, you're going to pick up on cues of, okay, this is right. Introducing Noah, as you start to pick this up, you're like, oh my gosh, this is a completely new scene, and so maybe reading it with patience and care. But a lot of this, honestly, it just requires being good students of God's Word. We can't just be casual readers, and some of the chiasms would have been a lot clearer to the original audience because of the way they would have used the Hebrew language, right? Maybe rhyming or wordplay or even idioms. So some of it's going to be hard, but as you're reading, if you're like, wait, he said this already, it's probably good to go back and just start highlighting, underlining. I'm a huge proponent of like jacking my Bible up. That's a terrible way to put it. Marking my Bible up, right? Underlining, highlighting notes. I don't do it nearly as much anymore because I do so much on my iPad. But my first Bible I ever had, my NIV, is just littered with notes. And so maybe it's you're highlighting it. Maybe it's you're seeing words that are just repeated and repeated and repeated. Mm-hmm. So there's not a great answer, but hopefully that gives you a little bit to go on. Good question. Yeah, never mind. I'm not going to go there. Other questions?
I guess like, what's the point of like the chiasm of like that you put like the example you put up there? Like it's cool to see, but like why is that so important to us to like recognize that?
Good question. So chiasms are really, really helpful to understand what is the main point of what the author is trying to communicate. Right? In our language, the main point usually comes at the end with some huge climax, right? But for them, when they're using the structure, it's going to be in the middle. So if we miss the chiasm, we're probably missing what's originally trying to be communicated to the audience, right? That chiasm, the center of it is God remembered Noah, right? And we're not going to talk about it tonight. We'll talk about it not this Sunday, but 3 Sundays from now. But then you've got to wrestle with, okay, why is this so important to the author? Or why did the author bury this, bring this massive magnifying glass to this single verse that God remembered Noah? Newsflash, it's because Noah's not the hero, which is pretty amazing. Yep.
I'm wondering, because I really like the point that you made about when we understand the original intent of what we're reading in the narrative sense, like, and using that as a deterrent from, I guess, like fruitless arguments or people trying to like poke at Christianity.
Yeah.
Is it fair to do that with the narratives? Like, people will bring up certain portions of Scripture, especially in the Old Testament, to make points, especially like moral arguments against God.
Yeah.
Is it fair to just bring up the fact that, well, that's not the point of this?
Good question. So my experience is if people are just out to pick a bone with something, then we're not going to get anywhere. But if they're genuinely asking and genuinely seeking out the truth, I lean into that and say, hey, that's a great question. And that is a challenging concept. Let's wrestle with it together. And we'll briefly touch on some of these genocide situations of the Old Testament and what's going on. But even that question, we have to remember is who's the enemy? Who's the antagonist? Satan, spiritual forces, sin. But we also have to recognize that, man, they play a way bigger emphasis on us and on our world and our dominion than maybe we ever realized. One of the things that's really inspiring about the Old Testament, but also exposing, is, man, the Old Testament, and I guess it's congruent with the New Testament as well. The supernatural or the unseen realm has huge implications on the Old Testament. Whether it's Egypt and their power, whether it's the Canaanites, and I guess we actually see that manifest itself even with demon possession and some of Paul's language in the New Testament. I'm rambling, but hopefully that begins to answer you asked. Good questions. Any other questions? Yep.
I have a question. So, like, for example, I just started reading Joshua.
Yep.
Like,
We're gonna read Joshua here in a second.
But yeah, so I looked at like what's the purpose? We're supposed to get out of it. The main things like God is protagonist and he's showing like he's fulfilling his covenant
Yep.
with the people. So I'm going through and I'm reading a chapter, which I know that how do you go about like if you're looking for chiasms and highlighting certain things? Like I actually read chapter 2 that I read. It was about Rahab, and it was like, oh, okay, I'm trying to remember that these are the main points, but it's like, how do you go about like when you're studying the book to like where to stop, where to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think I'm trying to just figure it out, but I just wonder, is there a better way to go about it?
No, I think that, one, that's a great question, because we all can't sit around and study something out for hours and hours and hours on end. We've got lives, we've got jobs. I think being really good at taking notes and even getting in the habit of looking back on those notes as we re-enter our study, right? To have something kind of fresh on our mind, to remember the main thread of what's going on. So as we enter this, we're like, oh my goodness, like, but even your question, right, that's like this endless journey of pursuing God, because that question isn't just about Joshua, but then you get to the New Testament and you start to see these threads that God's connecting back to the Old Testament. You're like, oh my gosh, like, and so it's this endless seeking after God, of seeing some of these threads. Good question. I think notes are huge. Other questions? Yep.
I know I'm just kind of jumping in the middle of this, but I think one of the things that I was taught early on was, to look at, if you can, look at the whole book, and just do an outline, and then go back and start, making your outline a little bit more defined. You identify the major points, go back and fill in details.
Yep.
And then you could really kind of dig in and you get an older picture as well as where you want to dig in.
Depending on the type of literature, yes.
Yes, exactly.
Right, but doing that with Psalms,
No.
even Proverbs,
I was thinking Joshua.
yeah.
Historical narrative.
Yep. Yeah, love it. Great. Go ahead.
We, the Bowling Green Church, are a diverse family devoted to the Bible on a mission to love God, love people, and see this world changed for Jesus. If that's something you're interested in joining and becoming a part of, please leave a comment below or connect with us on our website or on Facebook. Our website is thebowlinggreen.church. We'd love to connect with you and passionately pursue Jesus together. Thank you so much for worshiping with us, and we look forward to meeting you.